Hi, welcome back. And let's talk about the third module, which is about blood pressure regulation and some of the factors that affect flow of the blood. So the first slide, the print is small, but the idea here is a good introduction. Basically, what this slide is showing is a pressure gradient of the blood in the vascular system, in the blood vessels, which is a good introduction to what we're going to be talking about. The print is small in this picture. You'll have to look at it fairly carefully, but there's the average or the mean arterial pressure in the arteries. And here is the systolic pressure. It's this curve. And the diastolic pressure is the lower curve, lower point. And the average, the mean, is in between those. And later on, we'll look at a simple formula for estimating the mean arterial pressure. The other thing to note about this pressure gradient is, again, the print is small, but we're starting at the aorta, so closest to the heart, where the pressure is the highest. And if we're in the aorta, we have a systolic pressure of about 120-ish. And we have a diastolic pressure of, maybe 78-ish. So that's our systolic. Again, this is just an overview. This is just an introduction to what we're going to be looking at. So systolic and diastolic. We're going to start looking at arteries. And as we go further away from the aorta, as we get further away from the heart, we have elastic arteries, which are stretchy, and then we have muscular arteries that have a large amount of smooth muscle. They're sometimes called distributing arteries, and then they get smaller, and then we're down to the arterials. Meanwhile, the pressure is dropping all the way. We get to the capillaries, and there's a steep drop in pressure, and then we go to the veins, small to large, and ultimately back to the heart, through the vena cava. So that's our introduction slide. So we're going to start with the elastic arteries, and then we'll look at the muscular arteries next. So we're starting with these in this slide. And these are the arteries that are closest to the heart. So this diagram on the left is basically just showing, this is a piece of a large elastic artery close to the heart. The aorta, the common carotid arteries, etc., are very elastic. And these are the ones with the highest pressure. We just looked at the pressure gradient. And what's unique about the elastic arteries is that they stretch and then they recoil with that pulse pressure, the difference between the systolic and the diastolic. The pulse pressure is what you feel at different pulse points, like when you take a radial pulse at the wrist. You are palpating or you're feeling that thump of pressure when the ventricles contract. There's that surge of pressure, that diastolic wave or systolic wave that sweeps through the arteries. And the walls have mostly elastic fibers with very little smooth muscle, which allows them to stretch. So those are the elastic arteries. And again, it's very hard to see this writing, but the elastic fibers are within the walls of the artery. There's very little smooth muscle. So the next slide shows how they work. So this slide, again, we're looking at elastic arteries. And how they function. So the figure is, it's kind of a neat diagram. The figure is showing the ventricles. So this is the ventricle. It's representing the ventricle. And there is a semilunar valve, either the aortic or the pulmonary valve, and this is the aorta, which it would be since we're leaving the ventricle. This would be the left ventricle, and then this would be representing the aorta, which is very elastic. I may have a video that I took of a cow heart-lung dissection where we sliced a section of the aorta, and you can actually stretch it like a rubber band. Very elastic. So the idea in this figure is that during diastole, the ventricles are filling out to the dashed line, and then during systole, when they contract, the ventricles literally get smaller, and they force the blood out of the ventricle into the aorta. And there's a large surge, a large pulse of volume that enters the aorta, and the aorta is elastic, so it stretches. So this may have been the relaxed state, and then when the ventricles contract and eject the blood, this stretches like a balloon, which it is shown in the figure. Then the ventricle, so the blood was shoved out of the ventricle rapidly into the aorta. The semilunar valves close, and that's the lower figure. The valves now close. This would be the aortic valve, closes, and then the elastic recoil in the wall of these elastic arteries contracts, like the rubber band. And as it contracts, the valve is closed, so it pushes the blood along, and it leaves and just moves on down the vascular system. So those are the elastic arteries. Moving further away from the heart are the muscular arteries. And these, again, are sometimes referred to as distributing arteries, so AKA, also known as distributing. And they are what allow varying amounts of blood to be distributed around the body. The blood flow throughout the body is not constant. It varies. If you are exercising skeletal muscles, for example, you will divert more blood to the skeletal muscles. If you just had a large meal, you will divert more blood to the gastrointestinal system for digestion. So these blood vessels are medium size, moderate pressure. We're getting further away from the heart. Pressure gradient is going down. And tunic just means layer or coat. Tunic is a coat. So there's a middle coat and an internal coat. And I'm not making a big deal about that. But this is the middle layer of the muscular arteries. And the point is it is dominated with smooth muscle. Hence the terms muscular arteries. And these are the blood vessels that are able to vasoconstrict or vasodilate to allow different amounts of blood to be sent to different regions of the body based on demand, metabolic demand of the tissue. So we can shunt the blood and distribute it. And the next slide here shows changes in this distribution as a result of the muscular arteries changing diameter and shunting blood from one area to another. You don't need to memorize this table, but do take a look at the general idea. So we have different tissues on the left, and this is a chart looking at the amount of blood going to those different organs. And we are at rest. It's all in mils per minute of delivery. So there's resting and then there's exercise. So let's just take the extremes, rest and maximal exercise, and just look at the distribution changes. When at rest, lying on the couch, approximately 1.2 liters of blood is going to your skeletal muscles. When you start exercising hard, you can increase that blood flow up to about 12,500 mils, so 12.5 liters of blood a minute. About a tenfold increase in blood to the skeletal muscles. And when you're exercising, the muscles literally get pumped up with blood. As blood flows into them, they increase in size. The heart muscle, this is the myocardium itself, at rest, about 250 mils, quarter of a liter, and at maximal exercise, about 3 times that is going to the heart muscle. And that is supplied by the coronary circulation, the coronary arteries, and the cardiac veins draining the heart. This is one that's interesting, is the blood flow to the brain. Notice that it doesn't change. It is relatively flat. So it doesn't, the total amount of blood going to the brain, there's very little change from rest to exercise. What is interesting, though, in the brain is that though the total volume of blood going to the brain is fairly constant from rest to exercise, different regions of the brain receive different amounts of blood. So you can shunt and distribute the blood around in the brain to those areas of the brain that are more active. So when doing math problems, more blood is diverted to those parts of the brain that are processing the math problem. If you're playing music and concentrating on those areas or those activities, different blood flows to different regions. So you'd have more blood going to those music areas. That's the idea. The skin, this should make sense, goes from 500 to 19. So these are all increasing. So the kidneys, they go down. The gastrointestinal goes down. And the others are pretty much kind of ignore those. So the heart went up. Skeletal muscle increased with exercises. No change to the brain. And then for the kidneys, strenuous exercise, blood doesn't go to the kidneys as much. Cut it almost in half. Where's the blood going? To the skeletal muscles, the heart, and the skin. The same with the gastrointestinal tract. After a large meal, if you jump up and start exercising hard, the blood is going to be diverted from the GI tract to skeletal muscles, skin, etc. Which makes sense. Maybe that's part of the rationale for telling kids they shouldn't go swimming immediately after a large meal, because most of the blood, or a large amount of blood, would be in the stomach, in the gastrointestinal tract, not available for skeletal muscles. I don't know how much truth there is in that old adage or not. At any rate, that shows some distribution changes in blood with exercises. Again, the brain is no change. The skeletal muscle, heart, and integument increase. Kidneys and GI tract go down. That should make sense. Next slide, we're moving further away from the heart. So we're done with the arteries. And now we're down to the smallest blood vessels, the arterioles. And these are the smallest. They're nearly microscopic, and they supply capillaries. So this is representing a capillary. On the left. They have thin walls, and it's mostly smooth muscle. And note, hopefully this should sound familiar from last quarter, smooth muscle is innervated by the sympathetic division of the ANS. And this is what allows us to do vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And those two together affect blood pressure. So when blood pressure needs to increase, it's primarily the arterioles that are involved. They vasoconstrict. It's not the large muscular arteries that raise the blood pressure during vasoconstriction. It's mainly the small arterioles leading into capillaries. And we will spend some time with that, but that's an important relationship to keep in mind. Increased vasoconstriction, you're squeezing the blood vessels, you're squeezing the blood, and that causes the pressure to increase, the blood pressure. If you dilate the blood vessels, you are squeezing the blood less, and the blood pressure then decreases. So vasoconstriction increases blood pressure. The next slide is a review of the brainstem and the cardiovascular control system, or center. So here is our cardiovascular control center, and we are in the brainstem, the medulla specifically. You've seen this figure before, and the cardiovascular control center is pointing to this sort of egg-shaped little blue line that has several nuclei in it, and we've gone through those. I introduced those earlier. The ones that I want to review now is the vasomotor center. And this is the nucleus for those sympathetic fibers to the vascular smooth muscle. And this is primarily to the arterioles. 1 degree shorthand for primarily. To arterial smooth muscle. So that's where you're going to get your vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So one of the things to keep in mind is that blood vessels are always under some degree of vasoconstriction. And motor tone is just referring to the amount of constriction. So the idea is that if these sympathetic fibers become more active, you would get more vasoconstriction. If the frequency of action potentials to the vascular smooth muscle decreases, you would have less contraction, leading to more dilation. So again, this is where we are regulating the vascular diameter to regulate blood pressure. I hope that makes sense. We will come back to it many times. Sympathetic nervous system regulates vascular smooth muscle. Last figure in this short little section is the idea of Vasovasorum and the nervi vasorum. And all this is getting at, the idea here is that the Vasovasorum is simply the small microscopic blood vessels that supply the smooth muscle of the blood vessel walls, particularly arteries that have thicker walls. So this is the small blood vessels let's say that supply blood to the smooth muscle. I'm abbreviating muscle as just M. And this is an illustration of the Vasovasorum. And you can see these little blood vessels being represented in the diagram, going through and supplying oxygen and nutrients to the living cells of the blood vessels. And again, if we had a fresh cow aorta to look at, you can actually see the blood vessels. They come out through little holes in the arteries, and that's the Vasovasorum. The nervi vasorum is a similar idea. These are tiny nerves that innervate the smooth muscle. Small nerves that innervate smooth muscle. Of blood vessel walls. Have to get a signal into the smooth muscle to cause it to contract. So there is the smooth muscle. And this is showing a cross-section of a tiny little nerve that would have come in from the outside, and then it would have supplied the smooth muscle for contraction. So that's enough of an introduction to arteries. We will continue with capillaries next.